The only reason that, animal products, red meat in particular, gets so demonized is because of the saturated fat issue. And when you go back and you look at the data around saturated fat, the reality is that there is no good scientific reason to think that saturated fat has any relationship to really any negative health outcome, but specifically to heart disease.
Welcome to A Doctor's View with Dr. Polivios, a podcast discussing everyday topics in health, fitness, and mental well-being, as well as providing an insight into medical life and its challenges. Please note that all opinions of the host and guests should not replace advice from your own doctor. Now sit back and enjoy the show.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Polivios. This is a Doctor's View podcast, and I have with me a special guest on the show today. I've got Dr. Philip Ovadia, who is a cardiac surgeon, and since losing 100 pounds of his own weight has become an advocate for metabolic health, and I'm very happy to have him on the show. Dr. Ovadia, hello, welcome.
Hi, great to be here with you, Paul.
Thank you. I have to start with your weight loss. 100 pounds is quite a considerable amount. And how did you go about doing this? And when did you feel that you needed to do something about it?
Yeah. So, my background is that I was overweight my entire life, throughout my childhood and into adulthood. And I had tried to lose weight many times, as I went through college and medical school, and I would do, what I was taught to do at that time, which was eat less, move more, count my calories, and eat a low-fat diet. And, like most people, I had some short-term successes, but I would always gain back the weight I had lost and more. And about 6 years ago now, I really found myself at a crossroads. I was in my early 40s. I was morbidly obese. I was pre-diabetic, and I realized that I was going to end up on my own operating table, so to speak. And but I was kind of at a loss of what to do because, as I said, I had tried and not succeeded many times. Thankfully, at that time, I started to come across some different ideas about, why we get obese, why we get unhealthy. I came across Gary Taubes, who just happened to be one of the invited speakers at a medical conference I was attending. And, he was the first time that I had heard really the concepts that the types of food that we eat might be more important than the amount of food that we eat. And that real, kind of hormonal influence on weight specifically. And I read his books and I started, eliminating sugar and ultimately, went through a low carbohydrate kind of diet. And was able to lose 100 pounds. I've now maintained that weight loss for over 5 years. But what I really came to understand as, I went through that journey was what metabolic health was, why it was so important, and, how focusing on your metabolic health is really what ultimately leads to successful long-term not only weight loss, but prevention of, all these chronic diseases that are plaguing our society today, including the one that I am treating every day, which is heart disease.
Sure. Thank you. And how much did exercise play a role in the weight loss? It
really played a very little role in the weight loss. What I have found is, as I've gone through my health journey, I'm more interested in exercising. And certainly along the way, I've always tried to stay active. But I don't think that the traditional approach to exercise, dedicated hours at the gym or, running or doing cardio is necessarily, it's certainly not necessary, and it's probably not as beneficial as we think when it comes to weight loss. What I have come to realize the importance of is building and maintaining muscle as we age. We know that muscle, is the most metabolically active tissue. We know that the more muscle mass you have, the better that's going to be able to support your metabolic health. And of course, we have all of the data around aging and, maintenance of muscle or sarcopenia, muscle loss, and what devastating effects that has on, both our lifespan and our quality of life as we age. So that has really become my focus around exercise, both with myself and with the patients I work with, is to build and maintain muscle.
I see. And you mentioned carbohydrates, and that played a big part in this weight loss journey. Is that we hear a lot about carbohydrates and about sugar, and in your opinion, has this been the biggest problem with our modern diets?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure that it's carbohydrates specifically anymore. What I do know is that people who are metabolically unhealthy are not able to tolerate carbohydrates well in any form. In terms of what gets us metabolically healthy, is it the carbohydrates in particular? Is it the processed carbohydrates in particular? Is it other components of processed food, such as the seed and the vegetable oils? And the honest answer is, I don't know for sure. What I do know is that when we eliminate processed food and we eat, we stick to eating whole, real food, our metabolic health gets better. And, it's hard to separate the processed carbohydrates that are in those foods from the other stuff, the vegetable and the seed oils in particular that are in those food, and say, is it one or the other? But for the average person who's just looking to get metabolically healthy, the answer is eat whole, real food, eliminate the processed food as much as possible. And it doesn't really matter which particular component of the processed food it is. It just matters that you get yourself metabolically healthy.
That leads on to, what is metabolic health?
Yeah. So for me, the definition that I use is that when we are metabolically healthy, our bodies are taking the inputs that we're giving it, mostly in the form of food, and we are doing the proper things with it. So there are three, main things that are supposed to be done with the foods that we are eating. Some of that food gets turned into immediate energy to be used for fueling all of our, cellular and, kind of macro level activities. Some of that food gets used to build and rebuild our tissues, a process that's always going on in our bodies. And finally, some of that food is supposed to be stored in case there are times when energy isn't available to us. Now, when we become metabolically unhealthy, that balance gets thrown off and we end up storing too much of the energy and not having enough of the energy available to us, to fuel our activities anymore. We're not able to tap into the stored energy despite the fact that we have plenty of stored energy. So that, is kind of the working definition of metabolic health that I use. And then, the next question always becomes, how do you measure your metabolic health?
Yes.
Basically. Yeah. So, for me, I go to 5 basic measures of metabolic health. And these are, kind of the ones that are used in the most of the medical studies. And those 5 measures are your waist circumference, easy to measure at home, your blood pressure. You get it checked every time you go to the doctor, or you can go to the, go to your local pharmacy or, grocery store and get it checked. And then you have 3 blood measurements that we look at: your fasting blood glucose level, your triglyceride level, and your HDL level. And you look at those 5 metrics, and if they are within range, all 5 of them, you're metabolically healthy. Understand that is very unusual. The recent data we have here in the United States is that only 12% of adults can meet all 5 measures of optimal metabolic health. So 88% are not metabolically healthy. If 3 or more of those measurements are abnormal, it's the official medical diagnosis of the metabolic syndrome, what we used to call Syndrome X. And it puts people at very high risk of diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, many forms of cancer, and many of the other chronic diseases that plague our society have all been shown to have roots in poor metabolic health. And that's why I think it's so important to focus on metabolic health. When you get metabolically healthy, you are going to get to a healthy weight. But getting to the healthy weight doesn't necessarily make you metabolically healthy.
I see. And research must be going on all the time in terms of a few years ago, I'd never heard of metabolic health to the extent that it's being talked about nowadays, and finding out new things each time. And what's been like the most recent discovery with metabolic health that you can think of?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because it turns out that we've known about and heavily researched metabolic health for quite a long time now. Gerald Reaven, has done much of the seminal work, back in the 1960s, 1970s. And unfortunately, it sort of got buried or forgotten about as we became more focused on, cholesterol and some of these other issues. I think, probably the most important paper, from 2021 for me was the Women's Health Initiative study that came out. It was published in JAMA. And basically, it showed the relative risk attributable to different factors when it came to the development of heart disease. And what that paper clearly showed was that having poor metabolic health, they measured it with insulin resistance, specifically a measurement we call lipoprotein insulin resistance. And they showed that was a much more significant predictor of early onset heart disease than having an elevated LDL cholesterol level was. And so I think, that reinforced the importance of metabolic health. But the reality is when you go back through the literature from the 1970s and the 1980s, it was, very well known then that, insulin resistance was probably the most important risk factor, perhaps next to smoking, when it comes to heart disease in particular.
So you mentioned before pre-diabetic, you're in a pre-diabetic state when you were overweight. And what does that mean?
Yeah. So, honestly, we talk about in medicine pre-diabetes, and specifically that's usually referring to people who have an elevated hemoglobin A1C level that hasn't quite met the threshold for diabetes, but it's above what's considered normal. Here in the United States, 5.7% is, the cutoff for normal. 6.5% is considered diagnostic of type 2 diabetes. And, between those two, which is where I was, is considered pre-diabetes. One of the things I have come to realize, is that pre-diabetes is diabetes. And, the warning signs that go along with that really should be recognized even before you get to the elevated hemoglobin A1C level. If we were to pay more attention to fasting insulin levels as a metric, we would pick up earlier that people are, headed down this pathway and are headed towards poor metabolic health. And going back to those, measurements of metabolic health, it's interesting to point out that triglycerides and HDL are both markers of metabolic health. And we know that the ratio between your triglycerides and your HDL is reflective of, how insulin resistant you are. Specifically, again, when using the US units here, if the ratio, your triglycerides divided by your HDL are more than 2, that is an indicator that you are likely insulin resistant and have hyperinsulinemia, a high level of insulin in the fasting state. So, indirectly, that is in the measures of our metabolic health. But I would much prefer that more practitioners actually measure fasting insulin levels on their patients, because we know that fasting insulin levels will become elevated as much as a decade before the development of type 2 diabetes.
I see. And it's interesting you mentioned the ratio between triglycerides and the HDL, LDL, the actual, so triglycerides and cholesterol. So we've been, at least when I was at medical school, we were bombarded with and had this idea with or fixated with the ratio of the LDL, HDL ratio with just the cholesterol only. Triglycerides was very rarely mentioned. So I wanted to ask what your take was on the good and bad cholesterol ratio that we hear about all the time in the media and in the news.
Yeah, I think, in the end, LDL cholesterol is a fairly weak marker of risk, specifically when it comes to heart disease. And it really has no relationship to metabolic health. It is not a useful marker of metabolic health. The big question that, kind of remains unanswered is, if someone has an elevated LDL cholesterol level, an elevated so-called bad cholesterol level, and they are metabolically healthy, is that a situation that, is putting that patient at risk? And the honest answer is we don't know for sure. There are studies underway to try and look at that. We haven't really looked at that population before because, quite frankly, as I said, 88% of the adults in the United States are not metabolically healthy. So yes, for them, having elevated LDL cholesterol levels is certainly adding more risk on top of being metabolically unhealthy. Now, again, since we know that metabolic health is a bigger risk factor for heart disease than LDL cholesterol by itself, I would rather focus on the metabolic health part of it rather than being so focused on the LDL cholesterol part of it. In the end, the people that I work with, if you are metabolically healthy and your LDL cholesterol level is elevated, I'm not sure that puts you at any more risk. I think you need to look into it more. There are, more detailed lipid markers that we can look at, as particle sizes and ApoB counts and Lp(a), and all of these things play into the risk equation. I just think we've simplified this question too much. And for the average physician and the average person, that their only focus is your LDL cholesterol number, that one number, I think is doing a large disservice. And clearly, we're not seeing the results of that. Realize that statins have been the most prescribed class of medications now for 30 plus years, and heart disease remains the number one killer worldwide, for all of that time. So we're really not seeing the impact that we should be seeing if it was true that LDL cholesterol is the, sort of number one risk factor for heart disease, like people are led to believe.
That's interesting. Just on the flip side of that coin, would you say because also our population is increasing in terms of their body mass as well, that also has some confounding factor with it? So regardless of the statin prescriptions and what we're doing medically.
Yes, yes, it does from a number standpoint, because, being overweight, having a high BMI is, puts you at a higher risk of being metabolically unhealthy. But one of the other important things I point out to people is that it is not only possible, but it is common to be a normal weight and still be metabolically unhealthy. We see this in all of the studies, in the U.S. study that I referred to that, showed that 88% were metabolically unhealthy. When you look specifically at the normal weight portion of that study, almost 50% of them were metabolically unhealthy still. So, you can't make the assumption that just because you're not overweight, you're metabolically healthy. And this is why I think we need to be focused on metabolic health, not, just on weight or not just on cholesterol levels.
Sure. And I appreciate that you don't have to be overweight to be metabolically unhealthy. And I saw that in your book as a chapter as well. And one thing that struck me whilst working with treating quite unwell COVID patients during the last couple of years now, it seems to affect the overweight patients very badly, and to the point where it seems to be that most of ITU intensive care was filled with patients that were either had other comorbidities or were actually relatively fit and well but overweight. As in they weren't taking any medications, but they were very overweight. And I'm going to, obviously, the leading question is something to do with metabolic health, and if so, what's the mechanism, as it were? Is it this constant state of an inflammatory response that your body's always in terms of like a metabolic syndrome? What is it exactly?
Yeah, so I agree with you. Some of the earliest data we had around COVID, when we think back to, early in 2020, and we were getting the data out of China and Italy and New York, where the bad outbreaks were, it was very clear that, the people that were obese, the people who had high blood pressure, the people who were metabolically unhealthy were the ones that were, most prone to getting COVID and getting sick with COVID. And really my biggest sort of criticism of the response to COVID has been that we haven't focused on that aspect of it. If we had told people early on, get metabolically healthy, I think we would have come through this, a lot differently than we have. And that's not, a substitute for anything else. That doesn't mean you should or shouldn't get vaccinated while you're getting metabolically healthy. It's just that if we were metabolically healthy, we are able to tolerate infection, or, we have a much lower risk of getting infected with COVID. What it is particularly about being metabolically unhealthy that makes you more prone to get more sick with COVID, I think there are a number of factors, like you mentioned. We know that being metabolically unhealthy puts you at a baseline state of, inflammation throughout the body. And when if the body is already sort of in a mildly elevated inflammatory state, and then you add another cause of inflammation like COVID on top of it, the body isn't going to have the capacity to respond to that, or it might set off that kind of cytokine storm that we see in these patients that get sick with COVID. We also know that being metabolically unhealthy, specifically having elevated blood glucose levels, interferes with immune function. And so, you're less able to respond, from an immunologic standpoint, when you are metabolically unhealthy. And then there's just the simple fact of, if you're not in great shape to start with, and you're short of breath because you're overweight, and you get a virus that's going to attack your lungs, yes, you're going to be more prone. You're not going to have the capacity to, be able to tolerate that as someone who is metabolically healthy to start with. Or not overweight, and has good lung function. So I think all of that comes into play. And like I said, ultimately, I was saying from the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I continue to say, and many of the other physicians, who are kind of plugged into the importance of metabolic health, we're all been screaming that, we've had 2 years, we could have made significant impacts if the public health officials were talking about this, discussing with people how to be metabolically more healthy, so that you could better deal with this pandemic.
Yeah. It's not being taught, or at least it wasn't when I was at medical school. I didn't really hear much about metabolic health at all. And is that still the case? Or is it becoming more of a thing now?
I think I'm starting to see some glimpses of hope on that front, as it becomes more talked about both in the sort of popular press and in the medical circles, we're starting to see some headway there. For instance, I know of a few, current medical students who, are on social media talking about metabolic health, or they've reached out to me to ask about metabolic health. There are medical conferences now geared towards metabolic health. Now realize they're still small. It's still a very small percentage of physicians who are knowledgeable about this and talk about it. But it is at least a start. And I think, ultimately, the best way that we're going to get this message to keep spreading is that the practitioners who understand it, and the patients who are open to this information, continue to work together and just kind of, it's a grassroots effort and it continues to spread. And, one person influences many other people then, and that's how we continue to get this message out there. One of the things that's been most interesting to me is, when I go to these low carb medical conferences and I talk to the other physicians that are there, almost all of them have a similar story to me. They had to overcome their health problems. They found this information themselves, and then, it worked for them, and they started trying it with patients, and it worked for their patients. And, that's how the journey started for them. Unfortunately, I don't hear, any physicians yet who say, oh, yeah, I learned this in school. It was real interesting to me. And I started putting it into practice. But I think we'll get there one day.
And the initial journey, as you put it, say with patients, and we both know, and I think many healthcare workers can relate to this. Obviously, you can give the best advice in the world to a patient, and it's another thing them following through various reasons, and compliance can be an issue. How do you start this journey of someone comes into your clinic and you do the parameters, they are metabolically unhealthy, they're overweight? Where do you start?
Yeah, so, I usually try and frame that conversation as a choice to the patient. I say, listen, and, this especially applies to the patients who have come to me because they have advanced heart disease. We're discussing doing heart surgery. And, I say to them, you've been doing this stuff, you've been following the advice of your physicians, you've been taking your medications, and yet you're still here, coming to see me for heart surgery. Let's talk about why that may be. And, ultimately I frame it to them as an option, because that's what it is. All of our medical treatments are options. Even when I'm saying to them, you would benefit from heart surgery, I'm never saying you have to have heart surgery. If they say for whatever reason they don't want to have heart surgery, then, I'm going to see what else we might be able to do for them. And again, that's something that the medical system, I think, oftentimes, doesn't do a great job at. But I find when I give patients the option of, you can continue on a lifelong of medications. Those medications are probably going to increase. They are going to slow the progression of your disease, but they're not going to undo the disease. Or you can change some things about the way you eat, the way you live your life, and you can actually get off of these medications. You can undo the disease in many cases, we know now. Most of them are going to say, I want to make those changes. And that's how I kind of frame it. It needs to be a positive mindset. It needs to be a empowered mindset that we are doing this to make ourselves better, not that, you have to restrict this thing, to make you better. That I find is not sustainable in the long term. But when you give the patient the proper goal and you say, listen, you can get off your medications for your type 2 diabetes, you can get off your blood pressure medications, we can stop the damage that's being done by any heart disease that you have, perhaps, they feel empowered, they want to do that. And then you give them the tools that are necessary to, actually carry through.
Interesting. And what's the first kind of a bit of advice you give the patient? Is it start with these type of foods, cut out this type of food? What's like the first step in that journey?
Yeah, so first step for me is eat whole, real food. And I explain to them what that means is, eat the things that grow in the ground and then eat the things that eat the things that grow in the ground. Your animal products and your plant, and vegetable products, basically. And that's one of the key principles that I outline in the book. In the book, I have 7 principles of metabolic health that I go into. And that is, that's principle number 2. Principle number 1 actually goes back to the mindset issue that we talked about when I say that you need to think of your health as a system, not as a goal. And basically what that means is that, you don't want to be focused on those short-term goals. It's not about losing 20 pounds. It's about making yourself metabolically healthy. And we need to find those habits that are going to be sustainable for your metabolic health. And, the first habit is eat whole, real food.
Yeah. On the note of the animal products, there's been this, again, similar with the cholesterol debate that we've been hearing quite a lot about, saturated fats. And I wanted to hear what you as a cardiac surgeon say about saturated fats and also with the metabolic health side of things. What's your take on it?
Yeah. So, and again, those two are related. The only reason that, animal products, red meat in particular, gets so demonized is because of the saturated fat issue. And when you go back and you look at the data around saturated fat, the reality is that there is no good scientific reason to think that saturated fat has any relationship to really any negative health outcome, but specifically to heart disease. And this has been, covered in, unbelievable detail at this point by many people, guys like Malcolm Kendrick and Aseem Malhotra over there in the UK, and, David Diamond and many others have gone into this. The data is really quite clear. When we go back and we try and reconstruct why we came to believe that saturated fat was, something to be concerned about, may have been contributing to heart disease, we go back to the work of Ancel Keys, and we see that much of that data was either poorly done or maybe intentionally fraudulent, depending on how you look at things. But either way, you can't get past the fact that when you look at the randomized controlled interventional studies around saturated fat reduction, they have not shown a benefit. And it's only, poorly done epidemiologic studies that can show any relationship between saturated fat intake and heart disease. And even those have problems because we know, France, for instance, has the highest intake of saturated fat of any westernized country and one of the lowest incidences of heart disease of any westernized country. So those two facts, can't simply, can't go together if you believe that saturated fat is causing heart disease. So in the end, and the other thing to realize that I think most physicians don't realize, most lay people don't realize, is that the USDA, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, actually removed the limit on saturated fat now going back, more than 5 years ago. They specifically say that, there is not sufficient data to support the concern, to support saturated fat as a nutrient of concern is roughly how they phrase it in the report. They weren't very public about that. There wasn't the huge announcement that there should have been that, you don't have to worry about your saturated fat anymore. But the reality is that, again, I have no concerns around eating saturated fat. I have no, that is the ancestral diet that humans evolved upon. And, I do not limit my saturated fat consumption. I do not tell my patients to limit their saturated fat consumption. And the science does not support, making those recommendations to patients.
Am I correct in saying that the American Heart Association has also removed something about saturated fats within their guidance? I haven't looked into it in great detail, but it was something that I'd overheard from someone. I just wanted to see if that something that is true?
Yes, it is true that they have backed off. I believe they do still have, a mention of it.
Okay.
And they've kind of, they've sort of backed off, but they haven't really taken it out yet.
Sure.
And again, they certainly haven't come out and say, what I think they should say, which is, we were wrong about this. And, again, it's okay to be wrong in science. Science is evolving. I don't know if you hear the same thing, in the UK that we hear in US while we're going through medical school. But I was told many times during medical school that half of what I was learning in medical school was going to be proven to be wrong by the time I retired. We just don't know which half. And so, again, I think that the American Heart Association and these other organizations should come out and say, we were wrong about saturated fat. But, of course, there are other interests there, that maybe prevent them from doing so. And, so as an individual practitioner, I am comfortable telling my patients, and quite frankly, it's how I live my life, that, there's no reason to be concerned about the amount of saturated fat that you eat. One of the other, sort of paradoxes around saturated fat is that, there are other fats, there are other fat sources that are, purported as being healthy by these same people that are higher in saturated fat than animal products. Coconut oil is a great example. Coconut oil is actually one of the highest, saturated fat percentages of any fat that you can consume, any oil that you can consume. And yet you hear many of these same organizations that say avoid animal products will say, that coconut oil is a healthy fat to cook with. So it's just another thing that really doesn't make sense when you start looking into the saturated fat issue.
Yeah, I when I was growing up, and it was the don't eat too many eggs because of the high cholesterol count. Olive oil because it was unsaturated, polyunsaturated fats. They were good for you, and that was kind of the credo that I grew up with, as it were, and I think many people did, and still abide by. But yeah, it seems to be, as time's gone on, there has definitely been a shift towards that from different people that I've been chatting to and talking about this kind of thing. So it's interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you, weight loss aside, the benefits of becoming metabolically healthy, what other things will people notice? Because I appreciate they can potentially come off some medications that they need for their blood pressure and for diabetes if things can get back under control. But in terms of the way that they feel, because that's obviously the end goal, to feel better as well.
Exactly. I think, the most consistent thing, and probably one of the earliest things people notice when they improve their metabolic health, is just better energy levels, not being tired all the time. I certainly remember, thinking back, 10 years ago, before I was metabolically healthy, how, I would be tired in the afternoon. I would sometimes be taking naps in my office, after a long day at work, or, a long day in the operating room. And just that, kind of being tired a lot. And now, that's just simply not true. I mean, I have more energy now than I did in my 20s. I can go through very long days in the operating room, do all the other things that I do. I am a cardiac surgeon. I have my own medical practice on the side, a telemedicine practice. I'm out there speaking. I wrote the book, all of these things that I do. And I just seem to have, nearly endless energy. And I think that's probably the best benefit of metabolic health. What I tell people is, many of these things that we perceive as being normal as we get older, the aches and pains, in our joints, the muscle aches, the tiredness, the brain fog or loss of, kind of mental sharpness that many people experience. Many, if not most of these things are related to metabolic health. And when people get metabolically healthy, you hear about all of these things getting better. And then, as you said, there are the practical, sort of medical, applications of, we have shown that type 2 diabetes is reversible with a focus on metabolic health. We have shown that many people can correct their high blood pressure when they focus on their metabolic health. And then we know all of these downstream effects, like the heart disease and the cancer and the Alzheimer's disease, that we are, preventing when we remain metabolically healthy.
Thank you. And you talk about these mentioned before that the principles, you've got these 7 principles that you outline in your different chapters. And a lot of those things are outside diet. There are other things like sleep and like you said, mindset before. How much of an impact do those things have overall? Because I appreciate diet's going to be the main one to some extent in terms of your what you consume having an impact on your metabolism and your metabolic health. But how much of the other stuff is important?
Yeah, ultimately what I tell people is that, what we eat is the most important determinant of our health. But all of these other things are important. And as you mentioned, the other things I talk about are, making sure you get good quality sleep, making sure that you get enough activity throughout your day, making sure that you, deal with your stress. I don't talk about eliminating stress because we all have stressful lives, but you need to have some way of dealing with your stress so that it's not a constant, negative in your life. We know that all of these things play into metabolic health. There's, kind of a feedback loop where we see that when people get metabolically healthy, a lot of these other issues also get better. Their mental health, how they deal with stress, I should say, seems to improve. They sleep better. They want to be more active when they are metabolically healthy. So I always start with what we eat part of it, because I think that is the primary determinant, but certainly these other things come into play. And I encourage people as they're going through their metabolic health journey to start focus on those other aspects as well. But ultimately, I think if you're not eating the right food, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do all the other stuff perfectly and get the outcomes you're looking for if you haven't started with what you're eating.
Sure. I one thing I really liked actually, when you talk about the different diets in terms of how to eat, and you don't specify one specific diet. You break it down into how to eat metabolically healthy as a vegan diet, how to eat metabolically healthy as a carnivore diet, and the Mediterranean diet, and so on. And so you have all these different lists of diets that people can choose, as it were, and still eat metabolically healthy, which is quite unusual. You usually hear someone advocating one specific thing. You must eat this diet. You must eat this. You seem to have like a core principle around each kind of diet. What is that kind of main thing to eating metabolically healthy that you can do no matter sort of what diet you're following?
Yeah, it really comes back to what we talked about before, which is eat whole, real food and, eliminate the processed food. And when I was, writing the book and I was, kind of thinking about the book, that was a very intentional decision because it's the reality. I know what has worked for me. I know how I eat now, but I also know that that's not the right thing for everyone. And depending on, many different factors, where you are from a metabolic health standpoint, what you enjoy and don't enjoy when it comes to food, what's available and not so readily available to you when it comes to food. These are all things that are going to come into play. And ultimately, like I said, I'm not looking for that short term 28-day diet plan that's going to, get you some short-term success. I'm looking for people to establish the lifelong habits, the habits that are going to be sustainable for them to be able to maintain metabolic health. And that's why I, outlined it that way in the book. It's the reality of how I work as a physician. I literally do work with both vegans and carnivores and, everything in between. And our focus is on metabolic health. And if you can find a way of eating that is improving and, supporting your metabolic health, then I'm in favor of it. And I don't care what it is, I don't care which of those it is. But the basic principle that there's no getting around when it comes to metabolic health is that we need to eat whole, real food, and we need to eliminate the processed food. And that's ultimately what's going to make us metabolically healthy. And then it's up to each person within that framework to find what they enjoy and what fits into their lifestyle.
Thank you. And finally, where do we go from here? As you say, in the last sort of short period of time, even though we've had research going on since as you said, the 60s, and we're finding out new things, where do you think sort of the next step for this metabolic health trajectory is taking us?
Yeah, I think it's, just getting this message out to people because it is very much counter, the sort of public health messaging, the mainstream messaging from healthcare. So, my focus, besides working with the individual people that I work with, is to, kind of network with as many physicians as possible who are paying attention to this. I am proud to be one of the founding members of the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. It's an organization that is looking to really bring together not only physicians, but all of the various healthcare practitioners, the dietitians and the nutritionists and the nurses and everyone who's interested in this type of stuff together, give them educational materials, both for their own sort of professional education and then to be able to pass along to patients, hopefully ultimately, lead to being able to fund research efforts and things like that within the community. And then I think, one of the things that gives me hope, I guess I say, is that we got into this epidemic, this pandemic of poor metabolic health relatively quickly, within the past 50 years, essentially. Maybe, some of the things that set it off are going back 100 years or so. But I think that means that we can also get out of it, on the large scale, kind of evolutionary time frame. This is just a small blip in time. And I am confident that we will be able to undo this. It's just that right now in the thick of it, it seems very difficult because, as I said, we look all around us and all of us are unhealthy, essentially. 9 out of 10 people are not metabolically healthy. So it becomes hard to start to think about how do we get out of this. But I'm just hopeful that as more and more of us on the professional level are working on it and more people are paying attention to it because they want to be healthy and they realize that the mainstream advice is not getting them there, that we're going to, continue to grow these efforts.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting, and I've learned a lot, and it's actually made me want to read more and more about this and to try some of your principles and see how I get on, see if I have more energy, because I definitely would love to have that actually sometimes. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. I will also leave a link to your book in the podcast description for anyone who would like to have a look. And it's a good read.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. The book is widely available. It's called Stay Off My Operating Table. And then, anyone that's looking for more information about what I do, looking to connect with me, please go to my website. It's ovadiahearthealth.com, and you'll find all the information there.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to A Doctor's View. If you're enjoying the show, please don't forget to subscribe or follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcasting platform so you don't miss a future episode. If there are any topics you would like considered for the show, please get in touch via email at adoctorsview@gmail.com or visit adoctorsview.uk. And be sure to follow the show on Instagram at adoctorsview for some behind-the-scenes posts. See you at the next episode.